Picture this. It's a winter night in 1457, and somewhere deep within the massive stone walls of Pembroke Castle in Wales, a sound cuts through the howling Atlantic wind like a blade through silk. Not the cry of seagulls fighting the storm, not the crash of waves against the cliffs below, but something far more terrifying, the desperate, agonized scream of a child. But this isn't just any child crying in the night. This is one 3-year-old Lady Margaret Beaufort, and in this moment of unimaginable pain, she's about to give birth to the future King of England, the boy who will end the bloodiest civil war in English history and found the Tudor dynasty that will reshape the world. Before we dive deeper into this forgotten story of suffering and survival, if you're fascinated by the hidden truths of history like I am, please hit that like button and subscribe for more content exploring the dark corners of the past. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. It amazes me that we're connecting across time and space through these ancient stories of human struggle and triumph. Now, you might be asking yourself, how did a 3-year-old girl end up in such a horrific situation? How does a child giving birth to a child lead to the creation of one of history's most powerful dynasties? And what was the true cost of this medieval nightmare that changed the course of nations? The answers to these questions lie in understanding that Margaret Beaufort was no ordinary girl. Running through her veins was the blood of kings, specifically the royal lineage of John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, the 4th son of Edward III. But as Margaret would learn throughout her extraordinary and tragic life, royal blood could be both the greatest blessing and the most terrible curse imaginable. In the savage political landscape of 15th century England, where the Wars of the Roses were about to tear the realm apart, bloodlines like Margaret's made you either an incredibly valuable pawn in the Game of Thrones or a dangerously expendable threat to those in power. There was no middle ground, no safe haven for those who carried the genetic legacy of royalty. Margaret's journey to that blood-soaked birthing chamber began when she was still a toddler playing in the gardens of Bletsoe Castle. Born around May 1443 to John Beaufort, 1st Duke of Somerset, and Margaret Beauchamp of Bletsoe, she entered a world where political alliances shifted like quicksand, and marriage was the ultimate weapon of statecraft. But tragedy struck before Margaret could even form memories of her father. John Beaufort died when she was barely a year old, and the circumstances of his death would haunt her childhood like a spectre. Some whispered that he had taken his own life after suffering devastating military defeats in France that left him broken and disgraced. Others spoke in hushed tones about poison, because in those dangerous times, every unexpected death of the nobility was followed by rumours of murder, like vultures following an army. John Beaufort had commanded English forces in France during the final desperate phases of the 100 Years' War. He had watched helplessly as territories won by the legendary Henry V slipped away piece by piece, like sand through his fingers. The military disasters ate at him like a cancer, destroying his mind and spirit. When he returned to England in 1444, courtiers noted his hollow, haunted eyes and trembling hands. He spoke little, ate even less, and spent hours staring into nothing, lost in memories of failure and defeat. On May 27, 1444, he was found dead in his chambers at Wimborne Minster. The official cause was listed as fever, but those closest to him knew the truth. Whether by blade, poison, or simply the unbearable weight of failure crushing his soul, John Beaufort had chosen death over living with dishonour. This left Margaret's mother, the formidable Margaret Beauchamp, to navigate the treacherous waters of medieval politics as a widow with a baby daughter. She understood the brutal rules of survival in a world where women and children were only as valuable as the political alliances they could cement through marriage. And so, by the tender age of 6, little Margaret found herself betrothed to John de la Pole, son of William de la Pole, Duke of Suffolk. The marriage contract bound together two of England's most powerful families in what seemed like an unbreakable alliance. But in the rapidly shifting political landscape of medieval England, even the strongest alliances could crumble overnight. When Suffolk fell from grace and was brutally murdered while crossing the English Channel in 1450, that betrothal became worthless paper. Suffolk's crime had been negotiating the marriage of King Henry VI to Margaret of Anjou, and agreeing to surrender Maine and Anjou to France, terms that enraged both the English nobility and the common people. His death was savage, even by the violent standards of the time. Pirates or political enemies dragged him from his ship and forced him to kneel on the gunwale, while one of his captors hacked off his head with a rusty sword, requiring half a dozen clumsy, brutal blows to complete the execution. The Beaufort women learned early that survival meant adaptability. Margaret's next betrothal came swiftly, this time to Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, half-brother to King Henry VI, through his mother's controversial marriage to Owen Tudor. The Tudors were Welsh upstarts with questionable legitimacy, but they possessed something more valuable than ancient bloodlines: the king's favour. Owen Tudor had been a court official who somehow caught the eye of Catherine of Valois, Henry V's widow. Their secret marriage had scandalised the nobility, but it produced two sons, Edmund and Jasper Tudor, whom Henry VI recognised and elevated to the peerage, giving them noble titles and royal protection. In 1455, when Margaret was approximately 12 years old, she was married to Edmund Tudor in a ceremony that sealed political alliances with vows of love she barely understood and promises that would bind her to a destiny beyond her wildest imagination. The wedding took place at Bletsoe Castle, the same stronghold where Margaret had spent her childhood. Its great hall decorated with tapestries depicting the heroic deeds of her Beaufort ancestors. Edmund Tudor was a man in his 20s, seasoned by war and politics, experienced in the brutal realities of medieval life. Margaret was still a child, barely growing out of her childhood clothes, innocent of the world's cruelties. The marriage was consummated immediately because there was no concept of waiting for physical maturity, in an age when noble girls were treated as nothing more than broodmares for dynastic ambitions. The wedding night was a trauma that Margaret would never speak of in later life, but the evidence of its devastating impact would be written in her body's permanent damage and her lifelong religious obsession that bordered on fanaticism. Within months of the wedding, Margaret's body began changing in ways that terrified her young mind. The older women around her spoke in hushed tones about her condition, their faces mixing joy for a potential heir with deep concern for such a young mother. But Edmund Tudor would never live to see his child born. In the autumn of 1456, while campaigning in Wales against Yorkist forces, he was captured at Carmarthen Castle. The circumstances of his capture and subsequent death remain wrapped in the fog of civil war and political intrigue. Some accounts suggest he was taken during a surprise attack while his forces were scattered across South Wales. Others hint darkly at betrayal from within his own ranks. Whether he died of plague in his prison cell or was murdered by his captors remains one of history's unsolved mysteries. The plague explanation was certainly convenient for his captors, as disease was common in medieval prisons, and claiming natural death avoided the serious charges that would come with murdering a royal half-brother. But contemporary chroniclers noted the suspicious speed of his decline and the refusal of his captors to allow physicians to attend him. What we know for certain is that by November 1456, 3-year-old Margaret was a widow, pregnant, and utterly alone in a world that was about to explode into the most vicious civil war in English history. The news of Edmund's death reached her at Lamphy Palace in Pembrokeshire, where she had been staying while her husband campaigned across Wales. The messenger arrived on a rain-soaked November evening, his horse lathered with sweat from the desperate ride across the Welsh countryside. Margaret was in the palace chapel, kneeling before the altar and praying for her husband's safe return, when the sound of the messenger's boots echoed on the stone floor behind her. She knew, even before he spoke a single word, that her world had just shattered into a million pieces. And so we return to that winter night at Pembroke Castle, where 3-year-old Margaret Beaufort screams in agony as she attempts to bring forth the child who will one day sit upon the throne of England. But this is only the beginning of her story, because what happened in that birthing chamber would transform a terrified child into one of the most ruthless political operators in English history, a woman who would sacrifice everything, including her own motherhood, to put her son on the throne of England. Jasper Tudor, Edmund's younger brother, made the decision that would save both Margaret and her unborn child. He brought his pregnant, widowed sister-in-law to his stronghold at Pembroke Castle in Wales, where the massive stone walls offered protection from the growing chaos outside. But Pembroke was more than just a fortress. It was a castle on the edge of the world, perched on limestone cliffs above Milford Haven, where the Atlantic waves crashed endlessly against the rocks below. Here, in this remote Welsh stronghold, Margaret would endure the most harrowing experience of her young life. The journey to Pembroke in her advanced pregnancy was an ordeal that nearly killed her before she even reached the birthing chamber. Winter roads were barely passable, rutted with frozen mud and blocked by fallen trees. Margaret travelled in a horse-drawn litter, but each jolt and bump sent waves of pain through her swollen body. The journey that should have taken 2 days stretched to 5 as they navigated around flooded rivers and avoided bands of armed men whose loyalties were unknown in the chaos of approaching civil war. Pembroke Castle in winter was a harsh refuge. Built on a limestone outcrop above the Pembroke River, the castle dominated the landscape for miles around. Its great round keep, nearly 80 feet high, had withstood sieges and storms for 3 centuries. But comfort was never its purpose. Survival was. The castle's chambers were cold and draughty, warmed only by great fireplaces that devoured wood faster than servants could supply it. Margaret's rooms were hung with thick tapestries to block the wind that whistled through every crack in the ancient stones. The winter of 1456 to 1457 was particularly brutal. Ice formed on the inside of the castle windows, and the sea wind howled through every gap in the medieval stonework. Margaret, her belly swollen with child, could barely walk the length of her chamber without exhausting herself. Her body, still that of a child in so many ways, struggled under the burden it was forced to carry. The castle's physician, Dr. Lewis Caerleon, was a learned man who had studied at the universities of Oxford and Paris. He had accumulated 40 years of experience in the healing arts, delivered children to queens and peasants alike, and studied the ancient texts of Hippocrates and Galen. But as he examined the pregnant child in his care, all his learning seemed woefully inadequate. Dr. Caerleon was brutally honest in his assessment. Margaret's pelvis had not fully developed. She was, after all, still growing herself. The baby within her womb was large, positioned wrong, and showing signs of distress. During a private meeting with Jasper Tudor in the castle's solar, with snow swirling outside the arrow-slit windows, the physician delivered his terrifying verdict. He had seen this situation before, and it rarely ended well for mother or child. They could attempt to turn the baby, but that might kill both patients immediately. They could wait, hoping nature would correct the position, but delay increased the risk of the child's death and Margaret's complete exhaustion. Or they could attempt a cesarean birth, a procedure that was almost invariably fatal to the mother in an age before antiseptics, anesthesia, or any real understanding of infection. Jasper Tudor, barely 25 himself, faced the terrible burden of deciding his sister-in-law's fate. If Margaret died, the Tudor line would effectively end with him, a younger son with no legitimate heirs of his own. If she lived but lost the child, the same catastrophic result would follow. The political implications weighed heavily on his mind, but so did personal affection. He had grown genuinely fond of the brave, intelligent girl who had faced widowhood with such remarkable dignity. As Margaret's pregnancy progressed through the dark winter months, she displayed a maturity that seemed impossible for someone so young. She spent her time learning everything she could about politics and statecraft, understanding instinctively that knowledge would be her greatest weapon in the struggles that lay ahead. Jasper Tudor, impressed by her intelligence and determination, became her tutor in the deadly arts of political survival. He taught her to read the subtle expressions on people's faces, to hear the unspoken messages hidden behind diplomatic language, to understand the complex web of alliances and enmities that governed noble society. These lessons would prove invaluable in the decades to come, but they also revealed the transformation already beginning within Margaret. The terrified child bride was evolving into something harder, more calculating, more dangerous. Margaret also threw herself into religious study, with an intensity that worried her attendants. She spent hours in the castle chapel, praying before the altar until her knees were raw and bleeding. She memorized Latin prayers, studied theological texts with scholars, and developed the deep personal relationship with God that would sustain her through decades of political struggle. Some historians suggest that her extreme religiosity began as a coping mechanism for the trauma of child marriage and impending motherhood, a way to impose meaning on suffering that otherwise seemed senseless. The castle's priest, Father Meredith, became another crucial figure in Margaret's education. A Welshman who had been educated at Cambridge before taking holy orders, he understood both the classical learning of the universities and the practical politics of survival in a violent world. He taught Margaret that God often worked through human agency, that prayer without action was empty, but that action guided by prayer could literally move mountains. On that January night in 1457, Margaret's labour began with pains that doubled her over like a physical blow. She had been walking the castle battlements, taking the exercise that Dr. Caerleon insisted was necessary for her health, when the first contraction struck. The pain was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a crushing, tearing sensation that seemed to split her small body in half. She collapsed against the stone ramparts, gasping for air, while her attending ladies rushed to help her back to her chambers. The midwives, experienced women who had delivered countless babies over decades of practice, exchanged glances heavy with foreboding. They had seen this before, a child trying to give birth to a child, nature pushed beyond its limits by human ambition and political necessity. They prepared their instruments and said their prayers, knowing that before dawn broke over the Welsh cliffs, one or both of their patients might be dead. Dame Gwen, Fyrch de Fyd, the head midwife, was a woman who had been delivering babies for 30 years. She had learned her craft from her own mother and grandmother, inheriting secrets passed down through generations of Welsh women. She knew herbs that could ease pain, techniques for turning breech babies, and prayers that seemed to give supernatural strength to labouring mothers. But as she examined Margaret with gentle but expert hands, her weathered face grew increasingly grave. The other midwives prepared their instruments with grim efficiency. There were knives for cutting the birth cord, but also for procedures too horrible to contemplate openly. There were hooks and forceps for extracting dead children, potions to strengthen weak mothers, and holy relics to call upon divine intervention when human skill proved insufficient. The chamber filled with the smoke of burning herbs, lavender for calming, rosemary for strength, and other plants whose medicinal properties were known only to the women who tended births and deaths. For 18 agonizing hours, Margaret laboured in pain that defied description. Her screams echoed off the stone walls until her voice gave out entirely, leaving only gasping, animal sounds of suffering. The midwives worked frantically, their hands slick with blood as they tried every technique in their considerable arsenal to save both mother and child. Dame Gwen used massage, positioning changes, herbal remedies, and constant encouragement whispered in Margaret's ear. But nothing seemed to help the child's body cope with its impossible burden. Jasper Tudor paced the corridors outside, his boots clicking against the stone flags in an endless rhythm of anxiety. He could hear Margaret's screams through the heavy oak door, each one cutting through him like a physical blow. He knew that the future of the Lancastrian cause, perhaps the future of England itself, might die in that chamber. Servants hurried past with basins of hot water and armloads of clean linen, their faces reflecting the gravity of the situation. Father Meredith knelt in the chapel, praying without ceasing for the young woman whose life hung by the thinnest of threads. He had given her the last rites twice during the night, as her pulse grew weaker and her breathing more laboured. The priest understood that he might be presiding over both a birth and a funeral before the sun rose over Pembroke Castle. As dawn approached, Margaret's strength began to fail catastrophically. She had been in labour for nearly a full day, her young body pushed far beyond its limits. Dr. Caerleon, summoned from his uneasy sleep, examined her with growing alarm and spoke in urgent whispers with Dame Gwen. The baby was alive but in obvious distress, its heartbeat irregular and weak. Margaret was bleeding internally, her pulse becoming thready, and her skin taking on the pale, waxy appearance that experienced healers recognized as the harbinger of death. The decision was made to attempt manual extraction, a dangerous procedure that might save the child at the almost certain cost of the mother's life. Dame Gwen had performed the technique before, but never on someone so young and physically small. She positioned Margaret carefully on the birthing stool, praying silently to Saint Margaret of Antioch, the patron saint of childbirth, as she prepared to reach inside the young woman's body and guide the baby into the world with her own hands. When the baby finally emerged, literally torn from Margaret's body, in a process that nearly killed her, the midwives held their collective breath. The infant was pale, barely breathing, covered in blood and birthing fluid. For a terrifying moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, the chamber was silent except for Margaret's laboured breathing and the crackling of the fire in the hearth. Then Dame Gwen cleared the baby's mouth and throat with practiced efficiency, and the sound that changed the course of English history filled the ancient stones of Pembroke Castle. A thin, angry wail that announced the arrival of Henry Tudor, the future Henry VII, King of England. Margaret, barely conscious and her young body shattered by the ordeal, heard her son's first cry through a haze of pain and exhaustion. She tried desperately to reach for him, but her arms would not obey her mind's commands. Dame Gwen placed the baby on Margaret's chest for just a brief moment, the traditional first meeting between mother and child, before rushing him to the fire to be properly cleaned and swaddled. Margaret's eyes followed the infant with desperate intensity, memorizing every detail of his tiny face, storing up this moment because some deep instinct told her it might be the last time she would hold her son for many years to come. The damage to Margaret's body was severe and permanent. Dr. Caerleon, examining her in the days following the birth, found extensive internal injuries that would never fully heal. He spoke in whispers of torn flesh and damaged organs, of blood loss that had nearly proved fatal. The brutal truth was that she would never bear another child. This single traumatic birth had ended her reproductive life before it had properly begun. At 13 years old, she was effectively barren, her biological purpose as a medieval woman sacrificed on the altar of dynastic politics. But if Margaret Beaufort's body was broken, her spirit remained unshattered. As she recovered slowly in the months following Henry's birth, she began to display the iron will and calculating intelligence that would make her one of the most formidable women in English history. She understood, even in her weakened state, that her son represented the future of the Lancastrian cause. She also understood that a landless widow with a baby son needed protection in a world sliding rapidly toward chaos. The Wars of the Roses were erupting around them with increasing violence, and Margaret Beaufort was about to begin the most dangerous game of her life. The physical recovery from Henry's birth was agonizingly slow, but Margaret's psychological transformation was swift and terrifying to witness. For weeks, she hovered between life and death, racked by fever and infection that turned her young body into a battlefield. Dr. Caerleon applied every remedy in his considerable medical arsenal. Bloodletting to balance her humours, herbal poultices to fight infection, and strong wines fortified with medicinal herbs to restore her strength. Dame Gwen never left her side, spooning broth between Margaret's cracked lips and monitoring every subtle change in her condition. But it was Margaret's mind that underwent the most dramatic change. The trauma of her experience manifested in nightmares that left her screaming and crying in the small hours of the night, her voice echoing through the stone corridors of Pembroke Castle, like the ghost of her birthing screams. She developed an intense fear of physical contact, flinching away from even the gentlest touch of her attendants. Most troubling of all, her relationship with her newborn son became complicated by the association between his presence and her agony. She loved Henry desperately. That much was clear to everyone who observed her. But she could barely tolerate holding him without being overwhelmed by memories of his violent birth. The sight of his face would sometimes trigger flashbacks so intense that she would collapse, shaking and weeping, reliving those 18 hours of torment. It was as if her body had been programmed to associate motherhood with death, tenderness with trauma. Yet even as her body healed and her mind struggled with its wounds, Margaret began to display a cold, calculating intelligence that seemed to emerge from the ashes of her innocence. Courtiers who had known her as a quiet, pious young woman suddenly encountered a formidable political operator who seemed to see 3 moves ahead in every situation. The transformation was so complete that some whispered she had made a bargain with dark forces during her near-death experience. The truth was simpler and more tragic. Margaret had learned the most brutal lesson medieval life could teach: that survival required the complete sacrifice of personal happiness to political necessity. If she could not be a mother, in the traditional sense, she would be something else entirely: a strategist, a survivor, a woman who would spend the rest of her life working to put her son on the throne of England, even if it meant they could never have a normal relationship. Her first priority was securing protection for herself and Henry in a world sliding rapidly towards civil war. The Wars of the Roses were erupting around them with increasing violence. In 1455, the First Battle of St. Albans had announced that England would settle its dynastic disputes with sword and axe rather than negotiation. The White Rose of York faced the Red Rose of Lancaster in a conflict that would consume the nobility of England for 3 decades. Richard, Duke of York, claimed the throne based on his descent from Edward III's second son, while the Lancastrians held it through their descent from Edward III's 4th son, John of Gaunt. Margaret, holder of Lancastrian blood through her Beaufort lineage, was now automatically aligned with a cause that was losing ground rapidly. The Lancastrian king, Henry VI, was widely regarded as weak, possibly insane, and certainly incapable of effective rule. Margaret's solution was characteristically pragmatic: marriage again. In 1458, barely recovered from Henry's birth, she married Sir Henry Stafford, younger son of the Duke of Buckingham. The wedding was a quiet affair, nothing like the pageantry that had accompanied her marriage to Edmund Tudor. Margaret was still weak, still grieving, and her new husband was a stranger chosen for political utility rather than personal affection. Stafford was a Yorkist sympathizer. But more importantly, he was a pragmatist who understood that protecting Margaret meant protecting valuable Beaufort estates and bloodlines. For Margaret, the marriage represented safety for herself and her son, even if it meant sharing a bed with a man whose political loyalties opposed her own deepest convictions. The arrangement was more business partnership than romantic union, a practical solution to practical problems in an age when survival trumped sentiment. The marriage contract, negotiated by Margaret's mother and Stafford's father, was extraordinarily detailed, reflecting the complex political situation. Margaret would retain control of her Beaufort estates, ensuring her son's inheritance remained intact. Stafford would provide military protection and political cover for the family's Lancastrian sympathies. Most importantly, young Henry Tudor would remain under Jasper Tudor's guardianship in Wales, a provision that probably saved his life. The marriage to Stafford lasted 14 years, through some of the bloodiest conflicts in English history. Margaret watched from the sidelines as the fortunes of war swept back and forth across England like a deadly tide. Kings rose and fell with stunning rapidity. Henry VI deposed. Edward IV crowned. Henry VI restored. Edward IV triumphant again. Each change in the crown brought new dangers for those with questionable loyalties or valuable bloodlines. Margaret learned to navigate these treacherous waters with increasing skill. She cultivated relationships with women from both sides of the conflict, understanding instinctively that female networks often proved more durable than male alliances. She corresponded regularly with Elizabeth Woodville, Edward IV's queen, while maintaining secret communications with Margaret of Anjou in her French exile. These relationships required extraordinary diplomatic skill, because a single misplaced word could bring charges of treason and the executioner's axe. Throughout these turbulent years, Margaret's son Henry remained in Wales under the guardianship of Jasper Tudor. The arrangement was practical but heartbreaking for Margaret. She saw her only child perhaps once or twice a year, and then only under carefully negotiated conditions that ensured his safety. Henry grew from infant to boy, to young man as a stranger to his own mother, raised in the Welsh hills by his uncle, while she manoeuvred through the treacherous currents of English court politics. The separation was necessary but agonizing. Margaret poured her frustrated maternal instincts into letters, carefully coded messages that could pass through enemy lines without revealing dangerous information. She sent gifts when possible: books, clothes, small tokens that might remind Henry of the mother he barely knew. But mostly she existed in a state of constant anxiety, never knowing if her son was safe, healthy, or even alive. Henry's education in Wales was comprehensive and practical. Jasper Tudor ensured his nephew learned not just the usual noble accomplishments, riding, swordsmanship, music, and dance, but also the harder skills of survival. Henry learned to speak Welsh fluently, to understand the rhythms of rural life, and to command the loyalty of men who owed him nothing but respect. These lessons would prove invaluable when he finally returned to claim his throne. Margaret's own education continued through her marriage to Stafford. She learned to manage vast estates, to read financial accounts with the eye of a merchant, and to understand the complex web of obligations that bound medieval society together. She studied law, history, and theology with the intensity of a university scholar, building one of the finest private libraries in England, filled with works in Latin, French, and English on subjects ranging from military strategy to mystical theology. But Margaret's greatest education was in the art of patience. She learned to think not in months or years, but in decades. She began to see her son's exile not as a temporary setback, but as preparation for a destiny that might not be fulfilled until she was an old woman. This long-term thinking would become her greatest strength and her greatest burden. In 1461, everything changed again. Edward IV won a decisive victory at the Battle of Towton, the bloodiest engagement ever fought on English soil. An estimated 50,000 men met on a snow-covered field in Yorkshire on Palm Sunday, the 29th of March, 1461. By evening, nearly half of them were dead, their blood turning the snow crimson for miles around. The Lancastrian cause lay in ruins, its leadership scattered or dead. The aftermath of Towton created a new and dangerous situation for Margaret. Her Lancastrian blood made her automatically suspect in Edward IV's eyes, but her marriage to Stafford provided some protection. More dangerously, her son in Wales represented a potential rallying point for Lancastrian resistance. Edward IV had already demonstrated his willingness to execute enemies without mercy. Would he extend that policy to children? Margaret spent sleepless nights wondering if soldiers would come for Henry, if she would wake one morning to news that her son was dead. She developed an elaborate intelligence network, paying servants and merchants for news from Wales, bribing clerks for copies of royal correspondence, doing everything possible to stay ahead of potential threats. The constant vigilance was exhausting, but it kept her son alive. In 1469, Henry Stafford was wounded, fighting for Edward IV at the Battle of Edgecote. The injury, a deep gash in his thigh that became infected, left him partially disabled and increasingly bitter about his service to the Yorkist cause. He had risked his life for Edward IV and received little recognition or reward. The disappointment ate at him, making him receptive to Margaret's subtle influence. Margaret nursed her injured husband through months of painful recovery, using the time to gradually shift his political loyalties. She never directly advocated for the Lancastrian cause. That would have been too dangerous. Instead, she planted seeds of doubt about Edward IV's competence, shared stories of Yorkist corruption and incompetence, and gradually convinced Stafford that his service had been inadequately rewarded. The process required extraordinary psychological skill. Margaret had to overcome years of Yorkist loyalty, personal gratitude for Edward IV's mercy, and Stafford's natural caution. She did it through patience, repetition, and careful manipulation of his wounded pride. By 1470, when the Earl of Warwick began his rebellion against Edward IV, Stafford was ready to switch sides. But Margaret was thinking far beyond her husband's loyalties. She was building something much more ambitious, a network of nobles, merchants, clergy, and servants who could be activated when the time was right. She was preparing for a war that might not come for decades, laying the groundwork for her son's eventual return from exile. The political kaleidoscope shifted again in 1470 when Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, the powerful noble known as the Kingmaker, fell out with Edward IV and allied himself with Margaret of Anjou to restore Henry VI to the throne. The alliance was bizarre. Warwick had originally put Edward IV on the throne and fought against Henry VI for years, but politics made for strange bedfellows, and Warwick's wounded pride overcame his previous loyalties. Margaret watched these developments with intense interest and growing hope. If Henry VI could be restored, if the Lancastrian cause could triumph, then perhaps her son could return from Welsh exile. She began to reach out carefully to other Lancastrian sympathizers, testing the waters for a potential uprising. The communications were extraordinarily dangerous. Discovery would mean death for everyone involved. The restoration of Henry VI in October 1470 seemed like a miracle to Margaret. Edward IV fled to Burgundy, his brother Richard of Gloucester at his side, while Henry VI was led from the Tower of London and formally restored to his throne. The poor, mad king seemed bewildered by the turn of events, unsure how he had gone from prisoner to monarch overnight. But the restoration proved tragically short-lived. Edward IV returned from exile in March 1471 with Burgundian support and a small army of hardened mercenaries. He moved quickly, gathering support from nobles who had grown tired of the chaos and uncertainty. The decisive confrontation came at Barnet on the 14th of April, 1471, where Warwick was killed in the fighting. 2 weeks later, at Tewkesbury on May 4th, 1471, the Lancastrian cause died forever. The Battle of Tewkesbury saw the final defeat of the Lancastrian cause and the death of Edward, Prince of Wales, the last direct heir to Henry VI's throne. The prince died in the fighting, though some accounts suggest he was murdered after being captured. His death, combined with the mysterious disappearance of Henry VI himself shortly afterward, ended the direct Lancastrian line. Suddenly, Margaret's teenage son became the most viable claimant to the Lancastrian succession, and therefore one of the most dangerous people in England. His claim was complicated and distant, tracing through the Beaufort line, but in the absence of any direct Lancastrian heirs, Henry Tudor's blood began to look increasingly significant to those who opposed Yorkist rule. Jasper Tudor, recognizing the immediate threat to Henry's life, made a desperate decision that would change everything. He would take the boy into exile, rather than risk capture and almost certain execution. On a storm-lashed night in September 1471, 4-year-old Henry Tudor boarded a ship at Tenby and sailed into 14 years of exile in Brittany, beginning the most dangerous phase of Margaret's long campaign to put her son on the throne of England. The departure was hurried and desperate. Yorkist forces were closing in on the last Lancastrian strongholds in Wales, like wolves converging on wounded prey. Henry and Jasper had perhaps an hour's warning before enemy soldiers would arrive at Pembroke Castle. In that frantic hour, a teenage boy said goodbye to everything he had ever known and stepped aboard a ship that would carry him into 14 years of uncertainty, danger, and exile. Margaret was not present for her son's departure. She was in England, managing her estates and carefully maintaining her cover as a loyal wife to Henry Stafford, completely unaware that her child was fleeing for his life until days later. When the news finally reached her through her network of informants, the shock was overwhelming. She had spent 14 years separated from Henry by the breadth of Wales, seeing him perhaps twice a year under carefully negotiated conditions. Now they were separated by the English Channel and the hostility of nations. Standing alone in her chamber, reading the coded message that confirmed her worst fears, Margaret faced the possibility that she had just lost everything that mattered to her. Her son was gone, possibly forever. Her cause was defeated, its leaders dead or scattered across Europe. Her own position was increasingly precarious as Edward IV consolidated his victory and began the methodical process of settling scores with his enemies. But instead of breaking under this final blow, Margaret underwent another transformation. The grief of separation calcified into something harder than steel. If she could not be a mother, in the traditional sense, she would be something else entirely. A strategist, a survivor, a woman who would spend the rest of her life working to put her exiled son on the throne of England, no matter the cost. The change was remarkable to witness. Courtiers who had known Margaret as a pious, careful woman suddenly encountered a formidable political operator who seemed to see 3 moves ahead in every situation. She began building networks of support throughout England, identifying nobles who might be persuaded to support her son's eventual return. The work was dangerous and exhausting, but it gave her purpose and, more importantly, hope. Henry Stafford died in 1471, shortly after Henry's exile began. The timing was suspicious to some observers. Stafford had been in poor health since his war wound, suffering from recurring infections and chronic pain, but his death came at a remarkably convenient moment for Margaret's political manoeuvring. Whether natural causes, poison, or simply the stress of his wife's increasingly dangerous activities killed him, remains unclear. But his death freed Margaret to pursue her ambitions more openly. Margaret, now approaching 30 and twice widowed, faced a crucial decision about her third marriage. She could have chosen safety, marrying some minor noble who would protect her estates and leave her alone to grieve her lost son. Instead, she chose power. Her third husband was Thomas Stanley, Lord Stanley, one of the most politically adept nobles in England. Stanley was a master of the deadly game that had destroyed so many others. He specialized in backing the winning side at the last possible moment, switching loyalties with such perfect timing that he always ended up on the correct side of any conflict. His family controlled significant military forces in northwest England, and his political connections reached into every level of society, from the royal court to the merchant guilds. For Margaret, alliance with Stanley meant access to intelligence networks, political influence, and military resources that might someday prove crucial to her son's cause. For Stanley, marriage to Margaret brought him the prestige of Beaufort blood and connections throughout the nobility. The marriage was a partnership of convenience, but it proved remarkably effective. The wedding ceremony was elaborate by the standards of the time, designed to announce Margaret's continuing importance despite her son's exile. The festivities lasted 3 days, with tournaments, banquets, and religious services that drew nobles from across England. Edward IV himself attended, perhaps recognizing that it was better to have the dangerous Margaret Beaufort, where he could watch her, rather than operating from the shadows. Together, Margaret and Thomas Stanley navigated the dangerous final years of Edward IV's reign, surviving purges and political upheavals that destroyed many of their contemporaries. Margaret used her position as Stanley's wife to gather intelligence about royal policy and to maintain communications with exiles and potential supporters. Stanley provided cover for her activities while building his own power base for whatever conflicts might come. Meanwhile, in Brittany, Henry Tudor was growing into manhood in exile. The Duchy of Brittany was technically independent, ruled by Duke Francis II, but it was caught between the competing pressures of France and England. Henry's position there was precarious. He was valuable as a potential ally or bargaining chip, but also dangerous as a focus for English opposition to Edward IV. Letters between mother and son became even more infrequent and carefully coded as the years passed. They used false names, invisible inks, and elaborate codes to communicate. Messages were hidden in seemingly innocent correspondence about trade or family matters. The system was cumbersome and unreliable, but it maintained the vital connection between Margaret's intelligence network in England and Henry's court in exile. Margaret lived with the constant fear that her son was dead, killed by assassins sent by York or simply claimed by disease or accident in a foreign land. The not knowing was perhaps worse than definitive tragedy would have been. She developed an elaborate system of informants who brought her news from Brittany. Merchants, pilgrims, diplomats, anyone who had seen her son or heard news of his welfare. The intelligence network Margaret built during these years was extraordinary in its scope and sophistication. She had informants in royal palaces, merchant guilds, monastic houses, and noble households throughout England and the continent. Information flowed to her through a web of secret communications that would have impressed professional spymasters. She knew about troop movements before some commanders did, heard court gossip before it reached the king's ears, and monitored the health and loyalties of potential allies and enemies with obsessive attention to detail. Edward IV died unexpectedly in April 1483, leaving his 2-year-old son Edward V to inherit the throne. The king's death was sudden but not entirely surprising. He had lived hard, eating and drinking to excess, and his health had been declining for years. But his death at age 40 threw the kingdom into immediate crisis, since a child king required a regency that could easily become a dictatorship. But the boy king would never be crowned. His uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized power in a coup that shocked even the violence-hardened nobility of England. Young Edward V and his brother Richard disappeared into the Tower of London, never to be seen alive again. Richard III was crowned king in July 1483, but his reign began under a cloud of suspicion that would never lift. The disappearance of the princes in the Tower created one of history's most enduring mysteries. But for Margaret, it represented both terrible danger and unprecedented opportunity. Richard's usurpation had destroyed Yorkist legitimacy in the eyes of many nobles. Suddenly, Henry Tudor's distant claim through the Beaufort line began to look like a viable alternative to a king widely suspected of murdering children. Margaret began to plot with breathtaking audacity. Working through Bishop John Morton and other exiles, she coordinated a rebellion within England while arranging for her son to invade from Brittany. The conspiracy required perfect timing, extensive financing, and communications across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. She was planning nothing less than the overthrow of a crowned king. The scale of Margaret's ambition was staggering. She coordinated with the Duke of Buckingham, Richard III's former ally who had turned against him. She arranged financing through her merchant contacts. She sent coded messages to nobles throughout England, testing their loyalty to Richard and their willingness to support Henry's claim. Most dangerously, she maintained communications with Henry in Brittany, coordinating the timing of his invasion with the domestic rebellion. But the conspiracy was discovered. In October 1483, betrayal exposed Henry's planned invasion before he could sail from Brittany. Margaret watched in horror as her co-conspirators were executed one by one. The Duke of Buckingham was beheaded. Bishop Morton fled to Flanders. Dozens of nobles who had supported the plot faced death or exile. Margaret herself escaped execution only because of her marriage to Stanley. Richard III could not afford to alienate one of England's most powerful nobles by executing his wife, but he could and did strip Margaret of her titles and place her under house arrest. She was forbidden to communicate with anyone outside Stanley's household, her servants were dismissed, and her estates were confiscated. But even under house arrest, Margaret was not defeated. She continued plotting through coded letters hidden in household supplies and trusted servants who risked their lives to carry messages. She spent months planning not just her son's return, but his successful reign as king. She identified potential supporters, planned military strategies, and even began negotiations for Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York, Edward IV's daughter, which would unite the warring houses and legitimize Tudor rule. The patience required for this long-term planning was superhuman. Margaret had to think not in weeks or months, but in years. She had to maintain hope through repeated setbacks and failures. She had to keep her network of supporters loyal despite the very real danger of discovery and execution. Most difficult of all, she had to live with the knowledge that she might never see her son again, that all her planning and sacrifice might come to nothing. When Henry finally invaded at Milford Haven in August 1485, landing on the same Welsh coast where he had been born 28 years earlier, Margaret's patient cultivation of the Stanley family paid its ultimate dividend. The invasion force was small, perhaps 2,000 men, but it was supported by a network of English nobles who had been carefully prepared by Margaret's years of plotting. At Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August, 1485, all of Margaret's planning, patience, and sacrifice converged in a single day of battle. Richard III, fighting desperately to save his crown, led a cavalry charge directly at Henry Tudor's position. For a moment, it seemed as if Margaret's 28-year campaign might end in failure, her son cut down by the very king he sought to replace. But then the Stanley forces, positioned to support Richard, instead turned on him in the betrayal Margaret had orchestrated through years of careful manipulation. Richard III died fighting in the mud of Leicestershire, his crown literally picked from a thorn bush and placed on Henry Tudor's head. After 28 years of separation, 14 years of exile, and decades of patient planning, Henry VII was King of England. Margaret had achieved the impossible. Through intelligence, patience, and ruthless political calculation, she had transformed her exiled son from a fugitive into a king. But as she would soon discover, victory came with its own terrible price. The reunion between Margaret and Henry after Bosworth Field was not the joyful reconciliation of fairy tales, but something far more complex and heartbreaking. When mother and son finally stood face to face in the great hall of a captured castle, they were strangers bound by blood but separated by decades of necessity. Margaret was 42 years old, her hair prematurely grey, her face lined by years of worry and calculation. Henry was 28, a battle-hardened man who had spent half his life in exile, more comfortable speaking French and Breton than English. The awkwardness of their first meeting was painful to witness. Margaret had spent 28 years imagining this moment, dreaming of holding her son again, but the reality was that she barely knew the man he had become. Henry, for his part, regarded his mother with a mixture of gratitude and wariness. He understood intellectually that she had sacrificed everything for his success. But emotionally, she remained almost a stranger to him. Their relationship would never recover the natural warmth that had been sacrificed to political necessity. Instead of mother and child, they became business partners in the enterprise of ruling England. Margaret threw herself into the role of King's mother with the same calculating intelligence she had applied to his restoration. But there was a hollow quality to her triumph that observers noted with sadness. Margaret became the most powerful woman in England, but she never again enjoyed the simple relationship of mother and child that had been stolen from her by the brutal realities of medieval politics. She established herself as Henry's chief advisor, helping him navigate the treacherous early years of his reign, when Yorkist pretenders and rebellions threatened to undo everything she had worked to achieve. Her intelligence network, refined through decades of plotting, became the foundation of Henry VII's remarkably effective government. She knew which nobles could be trusted, which merchants controlled vital trade routes, and which foreign powers posed threats to English interests. The woman who had once used coded letters to maintain contact with her exiled son now used the same skills to help him govern a kingdom. Henry's marriage to Elizabeth of York in January 1486 was the culmination of another of Margaret's long-term strategies. By uniting the Red Rose of Lancaster with the White Rose of York, the marriage symbolically ended the Wars of the Roses and legitimized Tudor rule. But even this triumph carried personal cost for Margaret. Elizabeth was young, beautiful, and fertile, everything Margaret had never been allowed to be. Watching her son's happiness with his wife only emphasized the emptiness of their own relationship. The birth of Arthur, Prince of Wales, in September 1486 should have been a moment of pure joy for Margaret. She was finally a grandmother, the Tudor dynasty was secure, and her years of sacrifice had produced a royal heir. But the sight of Henry holding his infant son with natural tenderness only reminded Margaret of what had been lost between them. The easy affection Henry showed his children was something he had never been able to share with his own mother. Margaret channeled her frustrated maternal instincts into religious devotion with an intensity that bordered on obsession. She established colleges, funded scholarships, and patronized religious houses throughout England. Her charitable works were genuine and extensive, but they also served as penance for the moral compromises she had made in pursuit of power. The woman who had once manipulated marriages and orchestrated betrayals now sought redemption through prayer and good works. Her religious practices became increasingly extreme as she aged. She wore hair shirts beneath her royal robes, fasted until her health suffered, and spent hours in prayer that left her knees bloody and swollen. Some historians suggest she was trying to atone for the guilt she felt about sacrificing her relationship with Henry for political success. Others believe she was attempting to prepare her soul for a death she increasingly welcomed. The death of Arthur, Prince of Wales, in 1502 devastated the entire Tudor family, but it hit Margaret with particular force. She had invested so much hope in her grandson, seeing in him the future security of the dynasty she had fought to establish. His death at age 15 brought back all the old fears about the fragility of the Tudor line and the possibility that her life's work might still come to nothing. Henry VII's response to his son's death was to become increasingly paranoid and miserly, hoarding gold as if wealth could protect against the uncertainties of fate. Margaret, watching her son retreat into suspicious isolation, recognized with horror that the boy she had tried so hard to save had become a king trapped by the very crown she had won for him. The birth of the future Henry VIII provided some comfort in Margaret's final years. But even this joy was complicated by the knowledge that she would not live to see him reach adulthood. She devoted herself to his early education with the same intensity she had once applied to political conspiracy. But the irony was not lost on her. She could freely love her grandson in ways she had never been able to love her son. As Margaret entered her final years, the cost of her extraordinary life became increasingly apparent. She had achieved everything she had set out to accomplish. Her son was king, the Tudor dynasty was established, and England was more stable than it had been in generations. But the price had been the sacrifice of every normal human relationship and every simple happiness. The 3-year-old girl who had screamed in agony while giving birth to a future king had become the most powerful woman in England, but she had never again experienced the uncomplicated joy of motherhood. The political mastermind who had outmaneuvered kings and nobles had never been able to simply enjoy her son's company. The woman who had founded a dynasty had never been able to have a second child. Henry VII died in April 1509, and Margaret followed him to the grave just months later, dying in June 1509, shortly after witnessing the coronation of her grandson as Henry VIII. Some said she died of grief for her son. Others suggested she had simply held on long enough to see the succession secured before allowing herself to rest. In her final hours, Margaret was reportedly delirious, calling out for Henry as if he were still the infant she had nearly died bringing into the world. The political calculation that had sustained her for decades finally gave way to the maternal love she had never been allowed to express freely. She died, as she had lived since that terrible night at Pembroke Castle, loving her son from a distance imposed by the brutal necessities of power. Margaret Beaufort was buried in Westminster Abbey, with all the honours due to the mother of a king, but the Latin inscription on her tomb tells only part of her story. It speaks of her piety, her charitable works, and her role in founding the Tudor dynasty. It does not mention the scream that echoed through Pembroke Castle on a winter night in 1457, the sound of a child in agony bringing forth the future of England. Visitors to Westminster Abbey today can see Margaret's magnificent tomb, carved from black marble and decorated with bronze figures, but they cannot hear the echoes of that long-ago cry. They cannot see the 3-year-old girl whose body was broken to create a king, or understand the true cost of the political success that followed. The story of Margaret Beaufort raises questions that transcend the medieval period. What is the acceptable price of political success? Can the sacrifice of personal happiness ever be justified by historical achievement? And what does it mean when the founding of a dynasty requires the destruction of the very relationships that make life meaningful? Margaret's life was a masterclass in political calculation, strategic patience, and ruthless determination. She transformed herself from victim to victor, from powerless child bride to the power behind the throne. But she also paid a price that few people in history have been asked to bear: the complete sacrifice of normal human relationships in service of dynastic ambition. The 3-year-old girl screaming in labour at Pembroke Castle could never have imagined the woman she would become, the king's mother, the founder of a dynasty, the woman who ended the Wars of the Roses through maternal love, transmuted into political gold. But she also could never have imagined the loneliness that would accompany such success, or the way triumph would taste like ashes in the mouth of a woman who had given up everything that makes victory sweet. In the end, Margaret Beaufort achieved immortality not through the dynasty she founded, but through the questions her life poses about the relationship between power and happiness, between political success and human fulfillment. Her story reminds us that even the greatest triumphs in history often come at costs that the victors themselves can barely bear, and that the scream of a 3-year-old girl in childbirth can echo through the centuries, carrying within it all the complexity and tragedy of human ambition. That sound, and the story it began, remains buried in the stone walls of Pembroke Castle, where the Atlantic waves still crash against the cliffs and the wind still howls through ancient stones, carrying whispers of a girl who became a queen mother through suffering that no child should ever have to endure.